She was an adaptation of one of the most polarizing characters in Ninja Turtles history, an adaptation that almost didn't happen. She was brought back to life through a twisted experiment, fractured, broken, and incomplete. But could she reclaim herself in a world that tried to tear her apart? Join me in this season finale as I explore the self-determination of Venus from IDW Comics. Before we dive into Venus's story, it's important to understand the events that shaped her world. First, the mutagen bomb detonated at the end of the City at War saga, and second, the return of the dragon from the Shredder in Hell miniseries. If you're unfamiliar with these stories, you can check out my videos on both right here on this channel. The mutagen bomb in particular turned entire blocks of New York City into mutants. Unable, or unwilling, to deal with the fallout, Mayor Stockman built a wall around this new mutant town, trapping all the mutants inside. The mutagen bomb took a gang of punks from Fort Lauderdale, Florida completely by surprise. They were visiting the Big Apple for a concert, but when the cloud hit, they were mutated into the punk frogs. Two of these punks were in a relationship, Bonnie and Clyde. As a whole, this gang of punk frogs claimed a handful of city blocks as their territory. Not even the mutanimal enforcers dared to step into their turf. Now, when I say punk frogs, I'm talking about punk in the cultural sense. Bonnie and her peers embodied punk ideals. They refused to be boxed in and lived on their own terms, no matter what. At the heart of their turf stood the clinic of Dr. Jasper Barlow, a surgeon who had been mutated into a mouse. Disgusted by his new form, Barlow began performing surgeries on himself and on mutants desperate to regain their humanity, with mixed results. What happened next was never completely explained. We know that Barlow did some procedures on Bonnie, and she died on the operating table. Now, Barlow explained that he found her gravely wounded in an alley, alone. But we may never know how that happened. What we do know is that Barlow was working for the key players of the Armageddon game, trying to create doppelgangers of the Turtles, and he had been failing for a while to do so. Bonnie was his opportunity to make a turtle from scratch, so he used a discarded shattered turtle shell, and with the help of some magical scales from the dragon god, he was able to give life to dead tissue and effectively bring Bonnie back to life. This was very unfortunate for Bonnie. Now carrying a shell that was a mix of organic and inorganic materials, she tried to escape from the clinic. In one of these escape attempts, she was seen by Clyde. After seeing this strange turtle with a synthetic shell, Clyde assumed that the turtles had kidnapped Bonnie. Tired of Bonnie escaping, Barlow took her limbs away. Given her similarity with the statue of Venus de Milo, he named her Venus. Unfortunately, the punk frogs weren't exactly detectives, and when they found out Donatello had a synthetic shell, they set the whole dojo on fire. The turtles wanted some payback and clashed once more with the punk frogs. While doing so, Donnie and Alopix ran into Dr. Barlow's clinic and discovered his very unique and very creepy specialty. Barlow was particularly interested in restoring Donatello's carapace for an organic one, and he mentioned the approach wouldn't be too different from that of a patient of his. Donnie was curious about Barlow's methods, but also wanted to know who this patient was, as the punk frogs were after a turtle with a synthetic shell after all. He went back to the clinic to talk to Barlow, with Alopix sneaking behind him, just in case. That was when Barlow showed the dragon scales to Donnie and introduced him to Venus. Donnie figured out pretty quickly Venus was Bonnie after seeing a frog limb hanging from the ceiling. Donnie called her by her real name, and she started communicating with him telepathically, showing him images that confirmed his suspicions. Barlow saw the writing on the wall and took advantage of the distraction to drug Donnie and strap him to a machine. By the time Donnie woke up, he wasn't alone. He was next to Alopix and Sheena. The latter was there for a hair implant. But Venus was there as well, and with telepathy, he learned about Barlow's plans to create turtle doppelgangers. After the doctor started fusing him with dragon energy, Venus taught him how to survive its effects. This pushed Donnie to the astral plane for the first time, where he was able to remember his past life in feudal Japan, like he always dreamed he could do. By now, Barlow had moved on to a new plan that didn't require exact replicas of the turtles. This meant that he no longer needed to turn Venus into a turtle, and he could make her look more human again. She would still need the carapace with the dragon scale to hold her body together a bit longer. Donnie and Venus took advantage of their mysterious connection, and using their astral forms, reached out for the other turtles. However, Oroku Saki's presence was stronger, and he came in to free them all. On their way out, Venus used her magic powers to zap Dirtbag, and Clyde, who finally arrived with help, decapitated Groundchuck. Both mutants were Dr. Barlow's assistants and experiments. In the aftermath, and with Barlow apparently dead under the debris of his clinic, it was time to go home. Donnie wanted Venus to join them, while Clyde wanted Bonnie back. But Bonnie died on the operating table. This new persona, Venus, didn't have memories of her past life. And unfortunately, she didn't want to be defined within the expectations of the turtles either. Clyde tried to convince her to stay with him, and that was when her frog arm detached from her body. Venus losing her arm was some sort of accidental declaration. She shed her old identity like dead skin, and wasn't entertaining the idea of being defined by these two's expectations. No, she would take her own path and figure out who she really was. However, Venus took Donnie's discarded bandages and created some sort of braided scarf for herself. She could have taken a lonely journey, but she was immediately surprised by Bludgeon, the mystical blind mutated shark. He saw her immense aura from across the city and decided to help her. Unlike Clyde, who was trying to emotionally manipulate her identity, or Donnie, who wanted to satisfy his own curiosity, Bludgeon was giving her the opportunity to take a journey of self-determination and growth, so she joined him. Bludgeon secretly housed Venus at the Foot Clan headquarters, teaching her martial arts while she returned to health. During these training sessions, Venus started thinking about her human years, and an arm materialized, matching her new form. Bludgeon deduced that focusing on her lost memories could heal her fractured identity. But despite choosing her own path, Venus couldn't escape the strange pull she felt toward Donatello. Their connection, a gravitational force of sorts, was powerful enough to reach across distances and allow them to reconnect telepathically. Yet, it terrified her. Donatello's presence was overwhelming, and Venus feared it could cloud her own sense of self. She needed to know who she was on her own terms, not in relation to him or the other turtles. But something else was pulling Venus and Donnie together, a connection they would soon uncover in the most unexpected way. While Donnie was experimenting with space and time-related mystic powers, he ended up in the future, dragging Bludgeon and Venus with him. In that future, Donnie saw his future self, regretting his life and using a warp crystal to create tulpas of the people he left behind. After he left, present Donnie started reading about temporal magic to figure out how to return to the present. Going through old Donnie's journal, he found out about QNA, quantum nucleic acid, a temporal component of DNA, and a dimensional manifold existing outside of time, yet existing inside all of us. I'll talk more about this concept later. While Donnie studied QNA, Venus and Bludgeon witnessed their own future selves, training for a battle to come. Venus couldn't help but notice her future self, whole, confident, and finally at peace. It was a vision of what she could become. Before they could fully process it, future Donnie interrupted them, warning of impending doom. That doom arrived in the form of Armageddon, a giant mutated megalodon set on destruction. Venus and Bludgeon tried to help their future selves fight, but they were told not to, as they needed to survive to fight this battle. However, before the very end, future Venus asked present Venus to take her hand. When the two made contact, they exchanged Q&A, as they were always supposed to. Past, present, and future would exist simultaneously within Venus from then on. This event transformed Venus. She could now remember her whole life, even things she had yet to learn. Present Donnie and Bludgeon saved present Venus from being devoured by Armageddon. It was then that everything clicked for Donnie. The pieces of Donatello's original carapace had somehow ended up on a black market, where they were acquired by Dr. Barlow. This explained their connection. Venus and Donatello shared the same Q&A, binding them on a level deeper than either had realized. This revelation changed Donatello profoundly. Taking future Donnie's journal and a warp pencil, he vowed to prevent the rise of Armageddon. But Venus still avoided getting mixed with the turtles, and with Bludgeon, they moved out of the Foot Clan base and into a greenhouse. At the climax of the Armageddon game, no connection to Armageddon, the turtles finally learned the true nature of Q&A, thanks to Kitsune. She told them it was a scientific term for the spirit, their selves and memories. Q&A can be influenced by the radiant gravity of other entities, places, or thoughts. The Hamato clan's presence, Kitsune revealed, acted like a gravitational force. Their essence wove connections to others so strong they were nearly impossible to break. Despite this, the connections amongst themselves were not as strong as the ones forged with others. A good example of this was Jenica, someone who became so entangled in their orbit that they were forever changed, physically and spiritually, to align with them. In the end, the turtles used their gravitational pull to triumph over the Pantheon. Venus couldn't stay away from the turtles for long, and she finally met the rest of them when she sensed Mushroom, one of the weasels, was under Dr. Barlow and Leatherhead's control, being experimented with dragon scales. This was a decisive moment for Venus. She finally confronted Barlow and borrowed some dragon magic from Mushroom and used it to turn Barlow back into a small, mutated mouse, reducing the Twisted Surgeon to the thing he hated the most. Venus joined the rest of the Splinter Clan for pizza, but didn't eat any because she was vegan. The whole experience was the last shared adventure all the turtles had in the book, as they all drifted apart after it. One subgroup, Donnie, Venus, and April, joined forces to figure out how to stop Armageddon. Using the journal, Donatello and Venus created a wormhole, a small one, that they hoped could allow them to revisit the future, uncover more about Armageddon, and decipher the redacted pages. It wasn't enough to travel through yet, so they decided to return the next day. But the tiny opening was enough. Future Bob used it to contact Present Bob, a mutated mandrill studying under Leonardo, and convinced him to betray the clan. Armageddon promised to make Bob human again, a temptation Bob couldn't resist. The two Bobs altered the wormhole, and when Venus and Donnie returned, Future Bob ambushed them. In the chaos, Present Bob, Venus, and Donnie were thrown into the time tunnel. They landed 12 million years in the past when a giant megalodon almost devoured them. As the wormhole pulled them back, Donatello used magic to shield them, but the megalodon wasn't so lucky. It was dragged to the end of time, where excess Q&A mutated it into the monster that would become Armageddon. Angry and vengeful, Armageddon blamed Donatello for his grotesque transformation and swore to undo it by even erasing the turtles from existence if necessary. Venus, Donatello, and Present Bob began jumping through time, searching for old Donatello while fleeing Armageddon. Along the way, Armageddon attacked the Time Lord's temple in the 79th dimension of Null Time. Just before its destruction, Big Lita managed to send them away, but Bob revealed that Armageddon was tracking him. Meanwhile, in the present, Leo and April discovered Bob's betrayal. Bob stayed behind, siphoning Q&A for Armageddon, allowing the monster to remain free from his prison at the end of time. But his cover was eventually blown. Pressured to explain his methods, Bob demonstrated his abilities, turning present Lita back into her original human form. Perhaps Bob thought he was helping her, but for Lita, her mutation gave her family. For all his intentions, Bob couldn't understand that not all mutants wanted to be fixed. Future Bob pursued Donnie, Venus, and Present Bob through the timeline. During one ambush, Future Bob threw Present Bob into Armageddon, possibly sealing his own fate. Donnie and Venus pressed on, finally landing in New York on the night of the Turtles' mutation. There they were saved by Roy, Max, and Pris, tulpas created by old Donatello using a warp crystal with some of his Q&A. Their creation was Donnie's attempt to replace the family he alienated. These tulpas had part of his personality. Roy had his heroism, Max his sensitivity and anxiety, and Pris his obnoxious confidence. Perhaps because they reminded him of himself, he started hating them. Venus realized that it was their Q&A that she sensed, and not the real future Donatello. But they got their wishes when older Donnie showed up, and tired of his kids, he erased Max and threatened to do the same with the rest. Despite his cruelty, old Donatello finally gave Donnie and Venus the final pieces of the puzzle, the knowledge they needed to stop Armageddon. They went back to feudal Japan to prevent the monster from erasing the turtles from the timeline. They arrived after the death of the Hamados. They collected their Q&A with the intention of ensuring their reincarnation together at StockGen Labs. They came up with a plan to stop Armageddon there, using totems for each turtle, and therefore luring him into the Hamado gravitational pull. But to get him inside the Bellflower, they needed to downsize him, and the only way to do that was by jumping inside him and releasing an impermanent sigil. Donatello decided to sacrifice himself to do that. Knowing the future, Venus realized that Donatello still had much to do with his life, so she snatched the sigil from his hands and sacrificed herself, jumping inside of Armageddon, releasing the spell, and undoing most of his mutation. Now that Armageddon was smaller, Donnie used Venus's dragon scale as her totem to finally trap him inside the Bellflower. As their prisoner, Donnie put a permanent spell on him, turning him into a living statue. Before leaving, Venus messed up Bob's Q&A regulator. This caused some of the Q&A to escape and alter his physiology. He absorbed Lita's Q&A. This not only turned him into an albino mandrill, but he also saw her perspective and finally understood that some humans were happier as mutants, and he had no right to take that away from her. Bob was left behind in feudal Japan without a Q&A collector. Donnie, Roy, and Pris had an encounter with the ghost of Tang Shen, who revealed to Donatello that he didn't need to take the Q&A back to StockGen. The fact that he was still there meant that it all went full circle somehow. Donnie eventually returned to the present and reunited with his family and the now human Lita. It was Venus's spirit who took the Q&A samples back to StockGen, to a time before the turtles hatched, making sure that they all ended up together again. After finishing her last mission, she was welcomed into the afterlife by Shen and Yoshi, thankful for reuniting almost all of them. And in that moment, the cycle came full circle. The turtles hatched. To the average reader, it might seem like writer Sophie Campbell was introducing female turtles left and right, but the story behind this adaptation of Venus is far more complex. Sophie had been wanting to bring back the character for years. Unfortunately, when she took over the book, she was handed a brand new female Ninja Turtle that was pretty much a blank canvas. All of a sudden, Sophie had to figure out what to do with this character, and at one point, she even joked about it, saying that she could have just killed her off. Nevertheless, she took on the challenge that Tom Waltz left for her. It turned out it was only one of many legacy plots that Sophie had to figure out. When her original run got extended beyond 12 issues, her plans had to change, and she took the opportunity to finally introduce Venus. Her idea was to introduce her as a very young female turtle who would end up being adopted by the Splinter Clan. Jenica would have been revealed to be a tennis fan, and she would have named her Venus, like Venus Williams. But then it would be revealed that Venus would become a Time Lord in the future, wearing a yin-yang tattoo and using her classic Tessin. At the very last minute, she was told that they couldn't use Venus, and she had to change the character into a different one named Lita. Sophie still managed to add Venus in a small cameo of a scene from the future, but she wasn't named and was far away enough to avoid a copyright lawsuit. Months passed, and the option to use Venus became a possibility again. However, when Sophie pitched the character to Nickelodeon, they ran into some legal issues again. Hasbro owns Next Mutation, so certain characters are off limits. In any case, Nickelodeon came up with some rules to avoid trouble. First, her name couldn't be Venus de Milo, nor may PHE. she could only be Venus. Second, she couldn't wear a braided mask. Nickelodeon figured out that these were two significant attributes of the character, and avoiding them could keep them on the good side of the law. Sophie's dream was about to come true, but there was an obvious problem. Not only did she already have Jenica around, but she had also introduced a female turtle when trying to adapt Venus. Trying to make her feel unique from the other turtles, she came up with the idea of not making her a real turtle, something that fit very well into her Jasper Barlow plot. Sophie was stressed up to the last minute. When the cover with Venus was finally revealed, it looked like they were going to need to come up with a new female turtle at the last minute. Fortunately, everything went well, and Venus was finally introduced in the pages of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles number 127. And yes, at the moment of this writing, Venus is in the afterlife. However, Sophie expressed her intentions to revisit the character in the future, so who knows? She may return in some way or another. Jasper Barlow himself was a combination of a couple of characters that were off limits, Dr. Queeze and Dr. Farrell. Both Barlow and Bob bring up the realities of an event like the mutagen bomb. Some people would inevitably feel the need to go back to being human, to the extent of betraying others and harming themselves. And in their cases, their self-hatred was above other people's freedoms. Now, before we start making any real-life comparisons, it is worth mentioning that Sophie never intended to make any connections between mutants and marginalized communities in real life, as she felt like that would have been too crude of an analogy. Instead, the key to understanding Venus is her punk identity. Venus is the perfect antithesis to Jasper Barlow. Where Barlow represents the oppressive standards of human society, forcing his ideals onto others, Venus rejects those standards. Her punk nature is about rebellion, self-determination, and refusing to be controlled. The punk nature of Venus is quite refreshing. These punk frogs, unlike the ones introduced in the Fred Wolf cartoon, were part of the punk movement. But beyond this, Venus, being a punk, informs her character completely. This is why she was made whole once she made contact with her future self. She stood away from anything that could have influenced her identity into something she didn't feel she was. This was the ultimate act of self-determination. True to her punk nature, she burned bright and went out on her own terms, making the most of her second life and eventually becoming the missing link that reunited the Hamatos as the Splinter Clan. In a way, she even defied the laws of gravity. The turtles' presence pulls people into their orbit, changing them, aligning them. But Venus influenced them instead of getting trapped by their pull. In a world that tried to tear her apart, you could say that this was her way of reclaiming herself. What do you think about this version of Venus? Do you think she succeeded in finding herself outside of the turtles' gravitational pull? Will you miss Lita and Venus? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you next season.